Welcome to everybody joining us for the DIPG DMG tissue donation presentation on behalf of the International DIPG DMG Registry. This is something that has been requested by many of you to talk a little bit about not even just the tissue donation aspect of the registry, but how this happens and what tissue may be valuable, what tissue may not be, how you go about that, both from a patient perspective and a parent perspective. I'm Keith Esserick. I am the chairman of the Cure Starts Now. I also handle the medical related decisions for the Cure Starts Now and also the DIPG DMG Collaborative. We have two wonderful guests that are going to be talking to us about this donation platform and the International Registry. This is Dr. Cynthia Hawkins of Sick Kids. She is also the vice chair for the International DIPG DMG Registry. And we are also going to be joined by Courtney Blank, who is the executive director, I guess, within the International DIPG DMG Registry, and kind of puts together, how this works and performs. With that in mind, I wanted to spend just a couple of seconds here and talk a little bit about what the DIPG DMG Registry really is and give everybody a run through of really what kind of data is there. First of all, when we say the DIPG DMG registry, we're actually kind of referring to two registries. One of which is the International DIPG DMG registry that is based here in the United States and Canada and Australia, has obviously other countries that join that. That's the international component of it in 15 different countries. This is the one where it really started. This started back in 2011, and it started from our symposium and a desire to really start to identify patterns within DIPG DMG and be able to track data. Previous to this, and even still today, a lot of the data that was kind of captured on the backside of trials that may have been out there. And this data, while was a good idea, ultimately it doesn't really do well in terms of being able to compare it to many other buckets or different sets of data across many of these other trials. And so as part of that, we looked at it and said, what if we were to ask every newly diagnosed DIPG DMG every question that we could possibly ever imagine? And if we're able to pull that off, would that allow us to be able to examine patterns moving forward into the future? And that's how it started. Today, the registries are broken up by the International DIPG DMG Registry and the SIOP-E Registry, which is effectively more the European registry, and also some other countries there too. But and these were divided in 2015, more than anything else because there was confidentiality concerns with Europe, and we wanted to make sure that these two registries could continue at a good speed and try to be able to help the patients that they serve. The registry within the International DIPG DMG Registry has, and this is data as of last year, so it even is a little bit old and it has grown since then, but had 1,113 patients, had 117 institutions. We're quite proud of that. That's a very good amount of buy-in from institutions around the world. And the tissue banking, though, is done here locally at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. You can see the demographics. We put this up there because these are the questions that a lot of people tend to ask. So I'll let you go ahead and look at that at your own convenience. By the way, these can also be found if you go to the DIPG DMG or just DIPGregistry.org. You can actually see these stats in real time, and they're monitored and reported on. So you don't even have to look at the slide to get this. The second registry that I spoke of is the European Registry, or the SIOP-E DIPG Registry. Here you have another 1,034 patients. We have 16 countries that are involved with it, and the tissue banking is there done at Princess Maxima in the Netherlands. Here again, we put the statistics that you can look at and to try to get an idea of really what makes up this type of registry. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Courtney to go ahead and talk a little bit about the data collection and how the registry is comprised.
Hi, I'm Courtney Blank. Like Keith said, I oversee the operations team for the DIPG registry at Cincinnati Children's. So What we're looking to collect is just basic demographic data, any clinical data surrounding your diagnosis, including types of symptoms, duration of symptoms, anything that you're telling your doctor about when you first present with the diagnosis, all the different therapies you've received, including chemotherapy, radiation, surgeries, and even any non-traditional complementary therapies. Because we want to know if people are seeking non-traditional therapy and not just going the standard radiation and chemo routes. Any genetic data, if you had a biopsy or had any genetic testing done, radiological data, so all of your diagnostic imagings and MRIs, the baseline or your first images that have been obtained, we like to centrally review. Both the international and European registries centrally review all images to verify diagnosis. And then, of course, any tissue that's available, whether it's from a biopsy, autopsy donation, we'll bank the tissue and store it in our registry until somebody would like to use it for research purposes. With that, I just want to make sure everybody's aware that all data that's stored within the registry database remains de-identified. Your personal information is never shared with outside personnel or anybody. But basically, we just try to collect as much data as possible. Collaboratively, we've produced several research studies. The most impactful, I think, thus far is the long-term survivor manuscript that was published in 2018. And with that, they were focusing, the purpose of that paper was to focus on survival for greater than or 2 years, which the median survival for that was 11 months for that project. Diagnosis data was also utilized from both the international and European registry to look at the accuracy of central neuroimaging review versus confirmed histology, which the conclusion from that report confirmed that the accuracy of central imaging along with histopathic review, if available, is very important, and it does confirm diagnosis appropriately as demonstrated. Coming up this year, we are doing an updated report of the long-term survivor manuscript that will also be presented at an upcoming ISPNO conference this summer, followed shortly thereafter by additional publication. Another collaborative project that we're working on with the European group is looking at reirradiation practices and outcomes for DIPG patients. Sorry, so there are several ways that we can share our data and provide access. There is within the DIPG website, we have a links database which offers researchers and clinicians a snapshot of the data that is currently in our secure database. It's all de-identified. There are filters in place so you can see how many patients are in the registry, but filter out, for instance, if you want to know how many patients had reirradiation, you could filter it and see the percentage or about the approximate number of patients that had reirradiation versus non-reirradiation. We are working closely with our bioinformatics team to increase how we apply the filters to that system. But access is secure for that as well. So researchers can request access through the operations team. If researchers want a fuller set of data for a project, they'd have to submit a project proposal, which is then reviewed by our study chairs as well as our scientific advisory committee to make sure the request is appropriate. All data that is collected and sent out for researchers to review is de-identified. We run through it with our statisticians so that we can ensure that appropriate questions are being answered through the research. Researchers can also request tissue from the repository to do additional testing on research projects, and we have an upcoming project for that as well, where we're looking at tissue for DMG patients. This is again just a link from the long-term survivors paper, which also looked at diagnostic information from tissue as well as radiology review to confirm diagnoses. And I think I will hand this over to Cynthia.
So thanks, Courtney. So as Keith mentioned, I'm Cynthia Hawkins. I'm a neuropathologist at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto, and I co-chair the DIPG registry with Dr. Lindsay Hoffman from Phoenix. So Keith asked me to talk about what are the different tissue types and what we can do with those tissues. So the first is biopsy. So that would be if a patient received a biopsy, usually at the time of diagnosis. So those, in terms of viability, are really amenable to most research applications. So in other words, that tissue tends to be very good quality, including for cell culture. The main limitation of biopsy is they tend to be small. So obviously the first priority if somebody's getting a biopsy is we make sure that we can make an accurate diagnosis and that we can do any genetic testing that's required to make sure patients are, for example, eligible for clinical trials, and only any leftover tissue would then be used for research purposes, which, as you could probably imagine, can be quite small. Logistically, it's usually not a concern in most centers that have the capability of doing a biopsy to save tissue in a way that makes it useful for research. And the impact of biopsy studies has been quite broad. So multiple of the so-called omics studies have used tissue from biopsies, as well as some of the preclinical models that are used for us to test new treatments, for example. In other words, cell culture models, models where we put the DIPG cells into mouse brains, for example. Those have come, a lot of them, from biopsy samples. It's also the main source of pre-treatment tissue. So, for example, if we want to know what are the characteristics of the tumor tissue before you've received any therapy, this is really the source for that material. And the next slide is about autopsy. The second sort of major source of tissue in the DIPG world in terms of the discoveries that have been made comes from autopsies. And in the early days of DIPG research, this was really the major source before biopsies were widely done. In terms of viability, autopsy tissue is excellent for looking down the microscope and looking for the features of the tumor. Generally, DNA-based genetic testing is very easy to do on autopsy material. Up to even several days after death, the autopsy material is still viable for DNA. RNA and protein is a little bit easier to break down. And so if we go much past about 24 hours, that can be compromised. But certainly under that, we've been able to do very good studies using material that's collected at autopsy. The cell line work is a little bit harder from autopsies than from biopsies, but actually many of the cell lines that are out there and that are in use in many labs to test therapies have come from autopsy material. Logistics. So this is a little bit tougher depending on where you're from, but it is usually manageable with some advanced planning. And again, many of the tissues that have been used for research have come from patients throughout Canada and the US, even though those are huge countries and sometimes requires transportation, but it's usually, as I said, manageable. impact. So many of the discoveries about the genetics and biology of DIPG and DMG came from autopsy samples, and much of the research couldn't have happened without this critical resource. Important to remember that autopsy is the main source of tissue that we have at the end of life. So that's the tissue that was resistant to all the therapies we currently use. And so it's a really important way for us to understand what happened to the tumor and why was it able to evade all of the things that we're doing now. It's also really the only way for us to look at different sites of the tumor and see, you know, how heterogeneous is this tumor? Is it different in different regions? That's really not possible from biopsies. So I think both of them are complementary and play an important role in us really understanding what is DIPG doing over time, and how are we going to really approach this to try to maximize survival for this terrible disease. Some questions I think that people had in terms of analysis of tissue and when to analyze. So the first question in terms of, do reports back to family result in loss of some tissue? The answer there is no. So most centers now that perform biopsies will undertake some kind of genetic characterization in order to guide therapy, and that can be reported back to the family without compromising any tissue. Similarly, autopsy tissue is usually plentiful enough that it can allow multiple types of testing, and certainly reporting back to the family won't compromise anything that can be done with that. Should I wait for a trial or technological advances? So again, depends a little bit on what the tissue we're talking about. Of course, as I said, the first priority for biopsy tissue is diagnosis. So is it really a DMG or a DIPG? That requires looking down the microscope and usually requires some genetic testing. Some of that can be done in a fairly low-tech way. But again, most centers, certainly in Canada and the United States, have the capability of doing some genetic testing or can send it out to get that genetic testing done. So that would be the number one priority. That can be used to guide therapy decisions and for clinical trial enrollment. Any additional tissue could then be banked for either a future clinical trial, should, say, a new trial come up that requires tissue or requires a different type of testing to be done, then that tissue is there available for that. And then it could also be available for future research or for ongoing approved research studies at the treating center or through the registry. It's important to remember that technology is really constantly advancing, both on the therapy side, but also on what can we do with the tissue and what can we learn from it. So if there's sufficient tissue to be stored for future use, we would always try to do that. What about the time frame? So how long does it take? Current clinical genetic testing usually takes about 2 to 4 weeks in most North American centers. Of course, research-based testing may take considerably longer than that, and it really depends on what test we're talking about. You know, that's going to be very test specific. Types of analysis. So multiple types of analysis are possible, and these are constantly expanding. Typically, on a clinical basis, the tissue will be looked at under the microscope. And then, as I mentioned, most centers will do DNA or sometimes RNA sequencing on that tissue in a clinical diagnostic lab. Beyond that, on a research side, there's like a whole list of things that could be done, including looking at the proteins, so proteomics, looking at the metabolism of the tumor, that's called metabolomics. We can make cell lines, which we can then use to test different therapies, either in a tissue culture dish or in animals. And then newer technologies such as single-cell RNA sequencing, spatial transcriptomics, and so on can all be done with the tissue.
Okay, so patient and family logistics. How do I donate biopsy tissue? The key for this is to really consent to the registry and provide your PHI release of records and release of tissue. The operations team will coordinate with your primary physician and team to receive the tissue. Steps for postmortem donation: notify your clinical team as well as the operation team for your wishes for an autopsy or a postmortem donation. The operations team will work directly with your clinical team to coordinate the donation process. It's highly recommended enroll in the registry after diagnosis. This also provides some benefit to the patient. Patients can receive a international DIPG physician review of their records. You can discuss your choices with your local team, making the registry team as well as your local team aware of your desire for tissue donation. Start the discussions as early as possible. This will allow time to confirm that your local team is able to complete your request and allow for the operations team to assist with coordination of the tissue donation. Not all centers are able to perform autopsies at all hours of the night or weekends. So it's really important to have those discussions as early as possible. And provide notice when you can. We know that that's not always feasible. And then some contact information for the registry. We have a phone line. The team receives all emails, and then the registry website, and we respond to emails within 2 to 3 business days. Just do not always have people working on the weekends.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the review of it. We do have some questions I wanted to throw out, if that's okay. One of the questions is the operational team at DIPG.org, and who is on that team? I can answer that question. DIPG.org is managed by the Cure Starts Now, and we work in partnership with the collaborative there. We do work hand in hand with the DIPG registry in terms of trying to refer things over. But specifically, if you're talking about enrollment in the registry, or if you're talking about anything having to do with the tissue or the autopsy, we're gonna point you in that direction, because we want to try to step out of the way and try to make that as quick and as simple as possibly can. Some questions that I have that I've received here as well is, and this is probably more for Dr. Hawkins than anybody else. They've heard that some tissue may not be viable in some cases, and that sometimes it has to do with if it goes past that 24-hour period of time. Do you recommend that that you still donate that tissue, or is that a problem?
So I would recommend that you still donate the tissue. What you can do with it does reduce a little bit, but as I mentioned, it's still perfectly viable, for example, for looking under the microscope, which allows us to look at what do the cells look like, what other, what does the blood vessels look like. We can see some features of the effects of radiation, for example, looking at that. So we can use antibodies to sort of mark different proteins. A lot of that will still work, and DNA actually works still quite well. And, we've had patients up to 72 hours after death and still been able to do DNA-based analyses with that tissue.
And I would add to that from the perspective that I've been involved in a couple of patient scenarios where they've said that no, the day that it wasn't able to be donated or whichever. It's been the registry's opinion and frankly policy for quite some time that we will always consider it if it's out there and available, and we're not going to say no to it. So sometimes if you get your hospital saying, oh no, they decided that you couldn't do a donation, a lot of times it may be at the hospital, not necessarily with the registry. So please reach out, and we'll be happy to help you any way we can. And I got a couple other ones here as well. One of which deals with the access to the registry, which I think probably Courtney, it's probably going to be you more than anything else. That researchers are able to gain access to the registry through a link. But is that the same way that also pharmaceutical companies get access to it? And is that something that families can get access to?
No, industry sponsors don't have access to the links platform. It's a database that's mostly provided to researchers. I'd have to look at how we've done that in the past. I believe families have had access to the links platform historically. So if you reach out, I can look into that further. I apologize, I don't have that confirmation. I
Yeah, I don't think we've had it where the families have had links. Has that been the case, Cynthia, or am I incorrect on that?
I think the families can get access to the sort of higher level data. So I think, as you mentioned, Keith, if you want to go in and see, you know, how many patients had radiation, how many had re-irradiation, how many patients had
Okay.
chemotherapy, you can get that level of data. To get more patient level data, which is, I believe, what you're getting more maybe with links, is, you know, from a research standpoint, to get really more detailed information. So what we call patient level. So in other words, we could see on an individual patient basis, if you had not your name or anything like that, nothing that would identify you specifically, but we could see, you know, patient A had radiation, chemotherapy, and lived for 2 years. To get that level of information requires us to have ethical approval from our hospitals for that study, and to sign basically an agreement with the registry that we won't further share that data with industry, for example. Of course, we're allowed to publish that data, but not release that beyond the registry without that other group also having ethical approval. So there's some ethical criteria that we would have to go through in order to get access to those data.
And I think one of the ways that it's best understood is that this is not like a normal registry as most people think of it. With it being linked and organic and collected from the source, we're trying to preserve those links within that data as much as we can, because that hopefully can tell us the story of DIPG. It tells us a little bit of this, you know, how it develops over time. It tells us what it's connected to. Why do these certain things happen with it, and can we trace it back maybe to certain factors in the life or the age of the patient or wherewithal. Any time that we try to de-identify that and then put it out there, you're effectively stripping some of the most valuable information out of the database. So that's the reason why the registry is you really have to query it. You have to figure out what questions they are. So if an industry partner wants to get information about it, we don't just send the patient data right out the door. You can't. Okay, that you got to have that confidentiality. What the registry asks for is, it says, what do you want to collect? What are you looking for to do? And then it's queried behind the scenes. They then remove the remove the data that could create a confidentiality thing, and then they can deliver the data that will show them what the conclusions are. So for that reason, it's important that it does have that extra step to it. But what that extra step represents to our community in particular is that it's valuable data, and it is a very, very strong registry, which is what we want, because we want to be able to detect these patterns as quickly as we can. I have a question online. Are there costs to have, are there costs to, with regard to considering who performs the autopsy? Sorry.
So Courtney can probably answer that with respect to Cincinnati. I think if the autopsy is being, depending on where the autopsy is being done, that may differ. So I believe you can always have the autopsy done at Cincinnati, and then the cost is covered. Similarly, in Canada, we have funds to support transportation of the body to the Hospital for Sick Children and doing the autopsy there at no cost. Of course, you know, for some people, if that's not what you want to do and you're looking for the autopsy in your own center, then that is probably going to be variable. Courtney, did you want to add to that?
Yes, I agree. And also the registry is willing to cover costs for transportation and autopsy. So if you reach out and request, we can reimburse you for that as well.
Excellent. Another question is, you mentioned in the presentation about consent to donate tissue to the registry, but they're unclear as to exactly how that happens. Is that done through email? Is it done through a phone call? What's the best way to be able to do that?
Whichever way is more comfortable for you. We can do a Zoom or a Teams phone call, video call to consent, but we also offer electronic consent. So you would receive a consent survey through your email, so you can complete the consent form independently if you don't want to have a conversation or with the team, but the team's always available with questions to help you through the consent process.
And frankly, the phone numbers and the email address that you have up in front of you here, that's one way that you can do so. As Courtney pointed out, as early as you can, because we understand this doesn't happen. Nobody plans for this. I don't think any of us families do. You try to give as much notice on it as you can, particularly if you're maybe registering in hospice. This may be a good time to start having that conversation and having it both with the registry and with your local hospital too, so they can already start coordinating. Another question is, how does a family learn about what was found from the tissue? I'm guessing that's talking about if there were any information that was gleaned from it. I know, Cynthia, you talked about how sometimes it's not analyzed immediately. Is there any reporting mechanism from the registry back, or is that more of a hospital to patient relationship?
Generally, it would be a hospital to the patient sort of conversation. Again, it depends a little bit on where the autopsy is being done, I think. The registry, because the registry banks tissue and then releases it for different research studies, there isn't really a mechanism to return those results because those are all de-identified. So wouldn't be tied back to a particular patient. The results that are, so for example, in Toronto, if we do the autopsy, we actually have a follow-up with the family and go over the results. So myself, together with the neuro-oncology team, meets with each family. And I don't, Courtney, you may know what happens in Cincinnati as well.
The physicians, our neuro-oncologists, do the same after autopsy once they have results, which sometimes take several weeks, but they'll sit down and review autopsy and sometimes any imaging that was obtained during the procedure as well.
Okay, fantastic. I think that's most of our questions there. If you have any questions beyond that, I'm assuming, Courtney, it's okay to also send those to that referrals at dipgregistry.org mailing address. Will that work?
Yes, that would be great.
Okay, and you can certainly ask any questions that you have on it. I would stress there's a pretty important point in the beginning that Courtney talked about, which is that this isn't even just tissue. I think sometimes we get very, very caught up in tissue in these registries, and I think what you find out as you really start to see the full picture of it, that some of the other information can be as valuable. So it really shouldn't just be used or looked at from a tissue perspective. You want to look at it from everything that Courtney was talking about, the radiological, the demographic data, all of that, because I think what that does is that gives you the full picture of really what's happening in the time and the growth of these tumors.